Chris Lewit, back with another Prodigy Maker Show. And the title of today's show is Should My Kid Learn an ATP Forehand? Or should I teach the ATP Forehand? Or let's talk about the ATP Forehand. And should we even call it the ATP Forehand? So there's a lot of controversy and debate around this subject. It's usually a hot topic on YouTube and search engines and things like that. But let's discuss the ATP forehand, for lack of a better name for it. And in subsequent programs, I may talk about the ATP backhand, the one-handed backhand, and how it relates to the ATP backhand in terms of the evolution on the tour. And we can talk about other high-performance techniques or modern changes in the game in terms of biomechanics and technique. But the game of tennis is evolving at a very rapid rate relative to, I guess, other sports or in terms of historical norms. And I think that's an important part of this discussion. But it's great to be back with you guys. If you are logging in or watching live, you probably have some questions for me. You're probably curious about the ATP forehand. And I know a lot of parents who watch this show, and they're always asking me, should my kid learn the ATP forehand? Like, what are we doing here? Like, when should we learn it? Is it safe to do it? How do we do it? So let's kind of dive into it. I don't know how deep a dive we're gonna make. I could probably talk for a few hours on the subject. I have a book chapter dedicated to this subject in my new book, Winning Pretty, which is being published at tennisplayer.net and will be published in paperback shortly. So you can look for that book if you want a full, in-depth, evidence-based discussion. And if you follow my YouTube channel, we do lots of videos where I'm coaching young kids with ATP-Type or ATP-style technique. That's another common debate. Man, what a controversy. Is it a style? The size of the backswing, and there are other elements of the ATP forehand. It's not just the backswing, but that's what people usually see visually. They can see that the backswing is shorter range of motion. But is it a style? Nick Saviano, the legendary American coach, says it's a style. Is it a type? Is it a biomechanical type? I tend to lean towards that type of definition. Is it a biomechanical type? I think it is. I think it's an evolution in technique. So, like the legend Rick Macci says, it's a better way to hit the ball. There's not, he always says, if you quote Rick, there's not a right way, there's not a wrong way, there's a better way. So in this case, I think this is a better way. And I think, with the limited science that we don't have any peer-reviewed research on this subject. So a lot of what we do have is based on the research and private study of Brian Gordon, but Brian has not chosen to publish his private data and his private research in peer-reviewed journals. So that sort of leaves us in a gray area as coaches, as practitioners in the field. We want to teach kids cutting-edge techniques that will win at the highest level. I mean, if you're into high performance, if you're not just a country club coach or whatever, our goal and my goal as a high-performance coach is to teach my students, the best possible techniques that will equip them for the future. And so we just have a paucity of data on this subject. But we do have some field experience, which as coaches, sometimes we have to go by field experience. And we do have Brian Gordon, who I think is a pioneer in the field with his own private research, although it's not peer reviewed. So that is a big caveat and asterisk in the discussion or by that piece of evidence. But so if you have questions, let me know. I will start by just sort of, I think, like, what is it? What is the ATP forehand? A lot of people don't know. For a long time, it took me a while. I had to read a lot of articles by Brian. I have interviewed Brian, and there are a number of videos that are available either either mainly from Brian Gordon, and there's a lot of bad videos on YouTube. I would be very, very cautious if you're watching videos on YouTube about the ATP forehand. I did a full review of like what's available on YouTube for my new book, and there's a lot of bad videos with very questionable analysis and observation and recommendations. I think it's horrendously bad, possibly dangerous what's on YouTube right now if you search ATP forehand. I don't think my videos, but I'm talking about other channels and things like that. The channels that have a lot more subs than I do, even though I actually am a real high performance coach with a proven track record. Don't get me started on that. But anyway, so like, what is it? You know, essentially, you have a shorter range of motion in the backswing. This is how I try to describe it to parents, because parents ask me, you know, like, well, what is it? Like, why do we need to do it? Or why is it better? And what's it all about? Essentially, it's called the ATP forehand. I think Brian coined the term, the ATP forehand, possibly with Rick Macci. This goes back about 10 to 15 years. There is a presentation, I believe you can find it on YouTube, a USPTA conference, national conference presentation by Brian Gordon. I highly recommend watching the video where he sort of goes through a PowerPoint presentation on the ATP forehand. I'm not sure what he called it at that time. I think it's from 2013. So I'm just trying to put this into history here in a time context. 2013, so about, let's say, you know, 10, 12 years ago. And Brian introduced this concept with the help of John Yandel, who publishes tennisplayer.net, the world's best technical tennis magazine. I highly recommend it. If you like technique, check out John Yandel's tennisplayer.net magazine. It's a digital magazine, and he is one of the great technical minds and video analysts in the sport, in my opinion, John Yandel. And Yandel and Brian Gordon brought this conceptualization of this new type of forehand that Brian had been studying on the Pro Tour with men. And it just made sense to call it the ATP forehand because, you know, up until that time, let's say 2010, 2013, most of the women on tour did not hit that type or style. I'll just use style and type relatively interchangeably, but it's probably better to call it a type. And anyway, Brian had been analyzing this trend, and he has motion capture. He has motion capture systems that he uses where he can look at the joint rotations, and he can measure the speed of the joint rotations, and he can do a more in-depth analysis than simply high-speed video, slow motion video. So Brian, you know, has a PhD, and he went back to school to study biomechanics. And he has this unique perspective because he's looking at the joint rotations within a 3D or 4D, whatever he calls it, motion capture system, basically. And most of us don't have access to a system like that. So he has done his own private study of this for many years, and he brought this research, although it's not peer-reviewed research, to the USPTA, and he presented it to an audience of coaches. And I think it's a very interesting presentation. And I had to watch it about 10 times to just follow all the nuances and details of what Brian is trying to say. But I mean, I've read many articles by Brian on Tennis Player, and I've conversed with Brian, and I just think he's basically a genius in this area, in this subject. And he has predicted, he correctly predicted that this type of forehand would become the norm on the Pro Tour, and it has. In fact, almost every single player, male player professionally, hits with this type of short range of motion swing. And he has predicted as well that on the WTA Tour, the women will follow suit, that the women eventually will all adopt this new biomechanical type of swing, this new technique, because of its advantages, its inherent advantages. And that has brought a lot of criticism to Brian. That has brought a lot of heat. And, he's taken a lot of flack for that. And people have sort of mocked him and called him names and told him he's a quack or whatever, as you can imagine, for anyone who is visionary. And, when he first started sharing his ideas about the ATP forehand, I was lukewarm about it. At the time, I was a coach and still am a coach. And it's at that time, I sort of sat on the fence and said, this is really interesting. I'm going to experiment with this a little bit, but I'm not ready to, I wasn't fully ready to kind of buy into the new technique and teach it to everyone and really admit that it's better. But, over the last decade or so, it's kind of dawned on me that Brian is being proven right, like in real time in front of our eyes. He's being proven correct, because in the last 10 years, 15 years, the WTA players are moving towards this new technique. I was just at the Open watching Kasatkina, who's a good example of this. There's many, many other female players who are moving to this model. It's a swing that, for example, the Australian Open finalist Jennifer Brady demonstrates, and many, many others. And although there's still many women with longer range of motion forehands, the shorter range of motion forehand is, to Brian's estimation, about 40% of the tour now, moving to half the tour, which is a seismic change compared to, a couple decades ago, where there was one female who made who was way ahead of the curve, Justine Henin, and she had an ATP-type forehand in the 90s, 2000s. But that was pretty rare at that time. Very few women were doing that. Most women were taking very large, long, momentum-type swings using trunk rotation. That's one of the things about the ATP forehand. It uses trunk rotation, power from trunk rotation, acceleration from trunk rotation, but typically it's combined with a straighter arm. Brian says the arm should be closer to 150 degrees or more at impact. So you're looking at 150 degrees or more at impact for a straighter arm effect. And according to Brian, he believes that gives you more spin and pace combined. And some of this has yet to be fully vetted and proven, but his theory is that with a straighter arm, when you combine a shorter range of motion, independent arm acceleration, and I'll explain what that means in a minute, and the straighter arm configuration, you can essentially get the heavy ball that you see on the ATP Tour, and women and men can do it. You can get a very fast ball, good MPH, and good RPM, and a high spin rate. And he says that with the straight arm configuration, the straighter your arm is at impact, the more you can use internal shoulder rotation to get more spin on the ball without losing pace. That's the key. You can get a heavy ball, but also maintain a speed on the ball. Whereas with the WTA forehand, which is more of a looping style and uses primarily trunk rotation and some horizontal shoulder adduction, that style of swing can generate a lot of pace, but not as much spin with pace. So there's always an inherent trade-off with the WTA style. So for these sort of biomechanical reasons, Brian realized back in the day that this is going to become more of the norm for all types of pros, because as we know, every professional athlete is looking for an edge. They're looking for that little advantage, and they will take it if they cross upon it, if they come upon it, And in this case, there's a significant advantage if Brian's right, and I think he probably is right. If you can get more spin without sacrificing pace, and you can do it in a shorter range of motion so you can save time. And we know the game of tennis is just getting faster and faster, and the athletes are hitting the ball harder and harder. Then that is an optimal way to swing for the forehand. And it makes sense that more and more players are adopting that type of technique. The men have almost universally adopted that type of technique. So that forehand is now standard on the Pro Tour for men. And for the women, if we accept that it's maybe 40% and rising, even 40% is a dramatic change from, a decade or two ago. And if Brian's right, that number will continue to climb. And I'm watching more and more female matches. And if I put on my technical glasses and I love to watch tennis for the tactics and mental battle, but as a technician, I enjoy watching the technical battle that's going on. I look at the different styles or types of technique, and I'm always looking for the range of motion. I'm looking for how much extension is the arm getting to 150 degrees or more at impact. And I'm looking to see if there's independent arm acceleration, and I'm observing the elasticity of the arm, especially on the forehand. And to me, those are the key ingredients for the quote-unquote ATP forehand. And I'm seeing more and more women who are playing just like the men. You might as well be watching a men's match. You just take away the ponytail and the shrill grunts. But it just looks like two men playing. And I just think it just dawned on me, as it maybe dawned on Brian way before it dawned on me, that this is just the way it's going to be. This is the more optimal way to hit the ball. And then more and more women will just adopt that technique. It may take a few generations because there's holdouts, like with anything. One of the reasons there's holdouts is because there is kind of a group, or there is a belief that women can't do it. Like there's a very powerful message out there that women are not strong enough, that women could get injured, that they have a different body type that prevents them from using this optimal technique, which Brian rejects. And to be honest, I reject as well. And Brian doesn't see any reason why a girl or a woman could not utilize this type of swing mechanic, this type of swing technique, this optimal swing technique. So the ATP forehand has now become also the WTA forehand. There's still a mix on the WTA tour, but more and more it's becoming like a WTA forehand. In fact, so much so that it feels wrong to call it the ATP forehand anymore. In Australia, they call it now, Tennis Australia calls it the chest side forehand and the backside forehand, which I think are ridiculous names. But apparently, if you're coaching in Australia, this is the correct, politically correct terminology. So chest side would be the ATP type with the shorter range of motion on the right side of the body, and the backside would be the larger looping type for the WTA style forehand. But I guess some women are offended by calling it the ATP forehand, but that's how people know it, for better or worse. It has the most name recognition, and just for the sake of communication, that is how I describe it in my new book. But the ATP forehand is essentially, it's a shorter range of motion in the backswing. So the backswing usually, if straight behind me is 6 p.m., the backswing, the racket tends to be between 5 and 6 p.m. on the right side of my body if you're right-handed. And then there's a significant flip of the racket and lag. So this gets into the controversy about lag and snap that's all over the internet. Is there a lag and snap? Is there lag? How do you get lag? Should you teach lag? Should you teach children lag? These are like really common questions. But essentially, you can't really have an ATP forehand without lag, because there's no way. Just think about it logically. If you're taking a shorter swing if you don't generate lag in the racket head, you can't make up for the lack of like momentum buildup. You know, you need to create lag to get the racket moving at a high speed in basically like a small package, a small window in a small range of motion. So if you can try to think about it that way, I think it'll help you understand that the swing is smaller in the backswing, the take back is shorter in terms of the distance the racket travels, but the swing is fast or faster than when you take a much bigger, longer loop, like a big bubble loop around the body or over the head, like a helicopter swing, which a lot of young kids do to get power. They take a bigger windup. It's a proven way to get more power, to take a bigger windup. Most kids that I coach when they're young, when I tell them to ask them to swing faster, they take a much bigger windup. But the secret is, and the magic of it all, and then Brian Gordon did this innovative research, seminal research, even though it's private research. He figured out that there's a way, or players found a way, to swing smaller, but generate more force or the same force. And if they use a straight arm configuration of 150 degrees or more or less, they can get more spin. So they can hit the ball heavier with more rotation on the ball, which is incredible, incredible to think about. And so what Brian teamed up with Rick Macci in Florida the last 10, 15 years, and they started working together to try to develop a teaching system to actually teach this to adults and young kids, old teenagers, everyone, even very, very young kids, which is very ambitious, just to say the least, incredibly ambitious for them to try to do that. And they call it, the best system, biomechanically engineered stroke technique, best. And so rather than let this happen naturally or by sort of evolving as the player got older or stronger or whatever, bigger, Rick and Brian had been on the vanguard of trying to figure out a way to teach this type of stroke to young kids from the get-go, from the very beginning, and essentially a completely new type of teaching paradigm, a new way to teach fundamentals, which I think is incredibly ambitious. Some would say maybe aggressive, and some people accuse them of not being responsible, like it's too risky, but that's what they've done, and they have a lot of good field. They've done a lot of good field research that this is possible. It's possible to teach kids in a completely new way, for example, even young kids, to teach them in a completely new way, rather than the way we've taught tennis essentially for, a century or more. So that in its own right is an interesting story and an interesting discussion. But now many coaches around the world who are forward-thinking and avant-garde, and they want to be on the cutting edge, and who are essentially just observing, like myself included, observing what's happening at the pro level, looking at the way technique is changing. And we are also experimenting how to teach this to young kids, how to teach this to adults. Is there a better way to teach it? Is there a way to teach young kids so they don't have to relearn technique later on, or they don't have to change a neuromotor program later on? Is there a way to get these fundamentals into a young kid so that they save time and they have these optimal mechanics for when they become a high-level player down the road? That's essentially what's going on in the tennis world in junior development, especially in sort of the young kids world. At the same time, you have a significant chunk of coaches who are traditionalists, who are very conservative, and they are saying, whoa, let's just stick with the basics that we know. It's safe, quote unquote. It may not be optimal, but the kids can kind of grow into these new techniques, this new type of forehand, if they choose to. There's also a significant amount of people who say that young kids and girls are not able to successfully perform these types of movements. So there's just a lot of, there's a lot of shifting going on here. There's a lot of controversy. There's a lot of disagreement in the coaching world about this. But essentially, where I've come down on is I think that Brian is visionary. I think that he is probably going to be proven right about the women's game adopting the ATP type of forehand. And essentially, I would like to try to teach this technique to as many students as I can. I do take a slightly different approach. For example, I don't like to force these techniques on every young kid that I coach. I do work with many, many young players, young prodigies, different talent levels, but have a broad experience working with kids under 10, kids from the ages of 5 to 10 and under 12. And more I found success as I've been working on this type of forehand with young children. I've seen a lot of success. I've also seen how it's difficult. It's difficult to develop the timing, to synchronize the swing and get the independent arm acceleration. I'd like to just kind of explain that just for a moment. So if you can imagine the trunk rotating, you can get a lot of power from the trunk rotation, but the way Brian describes it, and I think it's just a great visual, is on top of the trunk rotating, you have this burst or this cascade of independent arm acceleration. And it's leveraging what's called the stretch shortening cycle in biomechanics. And that just means the tendons and the muscles are put on stretch, primarily in the internal rotators of the shoulder, but probably also in the forearm and other joints in the arm. But so the tendons are put on stretch, the muscles are put on stretch, and then there's this free energy return. When you use the stretch shortening cycle, you're able to increase the acceleration of your arm and the racket that you're holding on to with less purposeful effort. A lot of the energy return is free. It comes from like this. I'll use the word sort of like a snapback, but that's it's like a slingshot effect. And, some coaches get upset when you use the word snap. That's why there's a lot of debate about lag and snap. But basically, if you see the racket lagging, that means that the stretch shortening cycle has been put into effect, and the racket's going to whip through at a faster speed than you could generate through your own muscular contraction. So it's basically creating energy, and a relatively free energy without actually causing a contraction to occur, which is a really cool phenomenon. And it happens in all different movements and many different sports, and it happens on the serve as well. And in this case, on the forehand, if you can put your muscles and tendons on stretch by being very elastic with your arm and with the joints of your arm and your wrist, you can see that tremendous lag in the racket, and the racket will be whipped forward or snapped forward. I don't want to get too many negative comments if I use the word snap, but the racket will be whipped forward, and there's this cascade of power creation in addition to the trunk rotation that you see in the typical young kids forehand or women's forehand on the WTA tour. And Brian argues that this is optimal, and so what that enables you to do is to swing in a smaller range of motion to save time. So there's an efficiency case to be made here. You can save time, and you can arguably take the ball earlier. It really helps you on the return, for example, because you can make a smaller swing but hit the ball very powerfully off the return. And so these are some of the advantages. When you combine them with the straight arm configuration, you can also get more spin combined with power. So that's the idea. And I've had a lot of success teaching that to young kids, and I think it will be an advantage for them as they get older over kids who are doing big bubble loops and more WTA type swings. That being said, a few notes. I think that some kids really struggle to develop this type of swing. I don't know if it's because they're young. I wouldn't say it's because they're girls or boys. It's a gender issue. And I wouldn't say they're not strong enough, although that may be a factor. Brian has argued that strength is not much of a factor, but that is an open question for debate and research, and we do really need more research. As I mentioned, there's a paucity of research data on this particular subject, and there really should be some tennis-specific research on more research, peer-reviewed research. I don't think, if I do a search of journal articles, I don't think I'll find one on this topic, and this is kind of a big deal. It's kind of a major trend in biomechanics in the pro tennis world. I'll have to check that. I'll search that in the journal databases and see if there is any new research on this subject, but I don't think there is. So you have this trend where how can you teach it? You have this trend going on, and how do you teach it effectively to young kids? So I have a lot of little things I do. If you check my channel, you'll see I have lots of drills that I like. One of my favorites is just setting up a barrier, something to give the kid a guideline to block the big looping backswing, and then you just sort of work within that window and you try to develop the elasticity. The elasticity is really hard to get. The timing, the sequence of the joint rotations is really hard to get. So, because the players have to use their legs and hips to kind of pull the racket through, they have to create the lag and then whip the racket head through to the ball. And there's like an exquisite timing sequence that happens there. I think that's harder than anything to learn. To learn how to just control that energy burst is very difficult. It's not necessarily a strength issue, so I think young kids can learn it, but you need a lot of repetitions and a lot of time to learn how to get the sequencing right, and it's really hard for some kids, and some kids pick it up a little bit more easily. But I have sort of a method for doing it. I think it's very effective because if you try to just force it on a kid, it's just one of the things sometimes I don't like. What happens down at Macy's with Rick is I feel like they just sort of it's very heavy-handed, where they go in and kind of perform surgery on kids, and I don't really like that term. I always hear Rick talking about how he's performing surgery. I'm like, man, when you perform surgery, sometimes you get bad outcomes. So I don't think you should always go in there surgically, and I think that's a mistake that I've tried to correct on my teaching course. You can try to shape that small range of motion swing, try to get the elasticity, try to get the sequencing of the joint rotations, the timing, the cascade effect, the lag, the whip. But at the same time, there's a way that you can allow a kid to sort of go with a longer flowing loop if they feel more comfortable, and in a way, sort of bit by bit, and as the weeks and months go by, you can encourage them to take smaller swing, to be more compact, to learn how to whip the racket head and get that stretch shortening cycle effect, but not so heavy, not like put them in the surgical operating room to where they can't play. Like, because once you go into surgery and you change everything, like the kid literally can't hit a ball and they're a mess. And I see that happening with coaches who are kind of forcing the model or the type on young kids, especially young kids. I work with a lot of young kids. I think that is really, it's a heavy-handed way to go, and it can be very, very disruptive to a young kid. Because if you can't hit a forehand, you can't enjoy the game, you can't play, you can't compete. It's just a mess, and I think that happens a lot. So for the kids that are really invested in it, and like, or the parents like, I want this, we're going to do this, we're going to commit to this, we're not going to play a tournament for a few months or whatever it takes, okay. But what I found is kind of a middle road, which I think is really smart and really, really healthy, where you take a young kid, whether they're 6 or 7 or 8, or they're 8 or 9 or 10, and you say, look, this is the model that we're shooting for. We want to get to this range of motion. We want to get this. We want to get these technical details in. We want the elasticity, and we want the lag, and the timing of the racket whipping through, and but you can let the kid play with kind of a type. I call it a type 2, or Brian Gordon calls it a type 2. Brian Gordon has a great way, maybe the best way that we could all agree, if we could agree on the terminology, type 1, type 2, type 3. And type 1 is the old huge bubble loop helicopter type swing to generate power, that you still see sometimes with the WTA players, not as much with the men. You see it a lot with children. Type 2 is kind of the middle road that I'm talking about. And I'll guide a lot of young kids into this type 2 model of swing, where I let them take a bigger loop, maybe to 6 p.m. or even maybe 6:30 or whatever it is. And that way they don't have too much stress about it. They don't get too uptight about where their backswing size is. And then over the course of time, I keep encouraging them both verbally and visually and kinesthetically. We work on it, and sometimes in drills, and I say, look, we're trying to get this thing shorter. I want you to try to improve the range of motion in your backswing, get it closer to 5 or 5:30. This is for a right-handed player. And over time, it's sort of a softer way to do it, like a soft landing rather than just like crash and burn. It's like a soft landing approach, or it's like a gradual approach that I think is much more effective, both psychologically and maybe even motorically and neuromuscularly. It just gives the player some time to do all the repetitions that are needed. And at the same time, they can still compete, they can still play. And they're basically playing with the type 2. I don't really let kids do a type 1. Type 1 is like that really giant loop that is just excessive and wild. I usually clean that up right away. But you can let a kid do a type 2 swing for a year, for many years. It's not an emergency. They can do a type 2 swing, and you can still be fostering the future, which is a type 3 swing, which is the ultimate, the optimal Federer, Alcaraz, basically almost every top male player is the super compact short ROM range of motion swing. And you can also encourage, I work a lot on the straighter arm, but again, not like surgery. It's an encouragement. It's working on spacing. It's working on getting the arm as extended as you can, not forcing the kid to have a straight arm. A lot of times you try to force a kid to have a straight arm, and they get rigid and locked. So there's a number of different things going on here, but you're trying to get the shortened backswing. You're also trying to get as much extension and straight arm as you can on the forward part of the swing. And then during as you transition from the backswing to the forward part of the swing, you're trying to get good hip rotation. You're trying to have relaxed joints so you can maximize the stretch shortening cycle with lag. And all those things have to come into place. So it's like very tricky to teach a young kid, very tricky to teach anyone, an adult too. But you can see all the little things that are important there, and so give it time. You don't need to take a kid into the surgical room, operating room, and then now they're psychologically a mess. They can't play. Everyone's frustrated. They feel a lot of pressure. You can do it in a more gentle, gradual way, and I would recommend that. I would highly recommend that if you're a coach watching, or if you're a parent, consider that middle road. And there's no way if you're gonna take the score, like we're gonna do it or not approach, the approach like we're doing it, we're doing the ATP or bust. You can't play tournaments. Like I've had parents come to me like they were like, I want the ATP forehand, but I also want to play tournament every weekend. I got some L5, L4s coming up. We got an L2 coming. Like you got to be crazy. That's just not possible. That's not realistic, and you're gonna have a very, very unhappy camper if you try to do both of those at the same time. So I think there's a gradual method it's a much better way to teach this thing rather than forcing the model on let's say in this case young kids, especially young kids who are super young, like 5, 6 years old. In addition to the safety risk, which we haven't talked about, because the safety is not really known. Brian Gordon, from his private research, insists that it's safe. He's looked at the loads on the joints and he says it's safe, even for young kids. You know, intuitively, you'd think there'd be more load on the elbow or the wrist, but Brian, he says from his study, his private study, remember, it's not peer reviewed, that the loads are reasonable. You know, it's not like you're doomed to injury. And from what I've seen, it's held true. I haven't seen kids struggle with wrist or elbow or shoulder problems when they work on this type of swing. And maybe I'm teaching it in a safer way, or maybe there are some coaches that are teaching this type of swing irresponsibly. I don't know, but this is an area of safety that, as a parent, you need to decide, do I want to do this now at a young age? Do I want to wait a few years? Maybe take the gradual approach that I mentioned, take the type 2 to type 3 road, rather than just going like 10 and under type 3 and there's no escaping it. Because I've tried that with a lot of kids, and I've had a lot of kids get really, really frustrated when they weren't able to learn it quickly, and it created a lot of psychological turmoil. So I would just caution all you parents and coaches, if you're out there, if you want to if you want your kid to hit like this, and if you're a coach, if you want to teach it, I would definitely watch out for doing the all at once approach, all or nothing approach, because I've had a number of kids get very, very stressed because the backswing would slide, get too big when they're competing, and the parents would get all upset, and then the kids all upset, and everyone's upset. The coach is upset. Everyone's upset. So I think that there might be a better type 2 to type 3 bridge approach that's kind of a smarter and healthier way to do it, especially if you see that a kid's struggling. You know, if they're not picking it up relatively quickly, you can take that bridge approach rather than just going all or nothing. That would be my best advice. Have a question on the board from Dave Lee. What's up, Dave? My 6 and 9-year-old kids have a tendency to do the waiter style pancake serve. Should I insist that they fix this now, or is it okay to wait until they get stronger? That's a great question. That'd be a good topic for another show. I'm going to answer it for you because it has been actually something I've been studying recently. The pancake serve, the waiter serve, sometimes it's called palm up. I have a theory, and it's not based on a research study, but there are players, we know from high-speed video, there are professional players even who go palm up, relatively palm up, as they drop the racket into the acceleration phase, the cocking phase, as it's known in the 8-stage model of the serve by Mark Kovacs. However, it depends. You have to send me the video. Send me the video. Send me on WhatsApp. 914-462-2912. Send me the video and I'll see how egregious it is. If it's real bad, like what most rec players do, or most kids, they go like palm up real early and they don't get a proper acceleration, maximum external rotation of the shoulder, like deep drop, and then accelerate up on edge. If they're missing that part, then yes, it should be changed right away. If it's a very mild palm up or a mild waiter style position, it might not be an emergency. And some players will go into the back scratch or into the racket drop. They'll do that palm up, but then they'll correct the angle of their wrist, and then they'll have a proper acceleration upward on edge from the fully cocked position where the racket's at max external shoulder rotation. So it just depends. You have to look at the high-speed video and see. But in general, I like to fix that. With young kids, you said 6 and 9, I fix that right away. And it has nothing to do, it doesn't have a lot to do with strength. Usually the kids are strong enough. They may have to improve their grip or wrist strength to hold the racket vertically because maybe the racket's too heavy. Sometimes the racket can be too heavy. It depends on what type of racket you're using. But it is true that the racket tends to go palm up because it's a weighted stick, and it'll sort of force the wrist into that position if the kids aren't strong enough to hold it up. But in my experience, it's not necessarily a strength issue. They just have to be reminded to tense their wrist and squeeze tight and be strong in that position so the racket doesn't drift that way. Dave had another question. Is there anyone else you'd recommend to watch or learn from to help kids learn the ATP forehand? No, there's not many people doing this. This is a very new movement of coaches. I would say my best advice would be to go to the source and read all of Brian Gordon's articles, either on his website or at tennisplayer.net, and start there to get an overview. And I think Brian is on he's on the vanguard here. He's way out in front of most coaches or academics on this subject. And I would just use that as the best starting point. Obviously, Rick Macci's done a lot of field work in terms of on-court teaching of this type of forehand, and there are other coaches too that are less famous, let's say. But I just think this is a hard one to navigate because there's a lot of misinformation on YouTube, a lot of bad video, a lot of dangerous videos you could watch, and that'll guide you the wrong way with poor information. And then there's very few coaches. There's not many coaches out there experimenting and working on these things on a day-to-day basis especially with young kids, if you have young kids. So it's for now it's going to be that you have limited options. I think I'm one of the guys I'm doing a lot of work with this because I just happen to have so many young kids who follow me and come to train with me. So it gives me a unique I'm put in a unique position because I have many young kids who I'm building their techniques all the time. So I have that sort of that unique perspective, and not a lot of coaches are doing that, and many coaches are still teaching like very traditional strokes. For kids just starting to learn tennis, is it best to insist on ATP forehand form so that they don't learn suboptimal habits? Well, that's what I've been talking about this whole show, man. That's the debate. Do you want to build the muscle memory the correct way or optimal way when they're young, or do you want to sort of slowly evolve it? I think there's a case for both, and I think you could do both. I do think that the general trend is moving towards an ATP style forehand for both boys and girls, for both men and women. So I would like there to be a pathway for all of my students, whether it's immediately, if we're just going to go for it and take some time off from tournaments and get the technique now, or if we're going to take that gradual bridge approach that I mentioned, or a type 2 to type 3 approach, we could do it that way. That is a little, I think that for a lot of kids, I think that's probably a better way, sort of a middle way. Because as we know, I mean, what I like about that approach is worst case, if the kid ends up with a type 2 swing, they're still going to be successful, especially women. We know that there are women making millions and millions, like Coco and Iga and, all sorts of top female players who are still making a lot of money with type 2 swings generally. Usually not type 3, but sort of type 2 is sort of a combination of power coming from trunk rotation and independent arm acceleration, sort of a hybrid. So I think that's not a bad place to be, especially if I have a female student in front of me, So with boys, I want to see 100% of my boys with type 3 swing at some point. I have to make, that's my plan. For the girls, I'm moving more and more towards the type 3. It doesn't, like I said, though, it doesn't have to be immediate when they're young. It can be done gradually over time. So that it's less invasive. It's less invasive surgery. Dave says, Dave, you're blowing up the comment board. What's your view on kids learning the right technique versus getting in repetition? Should kids learn the right technique first and then go into repetition, or is it okay to do both at the same time? Well, the repetition should be of the correct technique. I don't agree with doing lots of repetitions with poor technique. So that's something you can maximize your efficiency. Try to get the best motor programming with you need repetitions, but never try to never try to let your kid do lots and lots of repetitions with poor form, because it just makes it harder to learn better technique later on. There are, some exceptions to that rule. Like it is like take a backswing for example. It is possible to gradually move a backswing towards a smaller form. If all of the other elements are in place and they're more or less good, the backswing could easily gravitate that way. But in terms of learning one whole motor program and doing lots of repetitions on it, and then planning to shift an entire motor program to a very different model later down the road, I think that's highly inefficient. Hope that makes sense. Dave, you should definitely look at my channel. I've done a whole podcast on orange, green, yellow balls, red, orange, green. In general, I believe I'm about 2 years ahead for red, orange, green. I'm not a big fan of the colored ball system. I certainly don't like the mandate. And as a lot of the viewers of the show know, I've advocated and argued that the USDA should change those age, and ITF too should change those age recommendations to more like 4, 6, and 8. So like 4 for red, 6 for orange, 8 for green, maybe 8 or maybe even, I forget my own recommendations. 4, 6, 8. I think basically around 8 is a good time to. In my opinion, most of my young kids are playing yellow ball by 8. So I just think push those age. I wasn't the first to propose that. I believe Wayne Bryan, in his famous letter to the USDA, was also had a similar stance. Push the age divisions up. Maybe 4, maybe even younger. 2 or 3 for red, 4, 5 for orange, 6 and 7 green, and 8 and 9 yellows, something like that. That for high performance, for developing champion player, that for talented kids, that's definitely more the way I see it. And most of my young kids at 7, 8, 9 are all playing yellow ball. If they're talented, if they're athletic, it's very easy. It's not that difficult to play yellow ball. The kids who are not athletic, who are less gifted, maybe they could play with the colored ball longer, but I don't focus a lot on those types of kids in my own coaching. Dave says, should kids err on a lighter racket or heavier racket? The racket, you have to look at the kid individually. Generally, I mean, lighter is safer, but if you can go a little heavier, then they can manage it and they can wield it safely. They can get a little stronger that way, and they're going to play better with a little bit heavier. So it's a tricky question. You have to see the kid. You have to sort of watch them swing with a particular type of racket. I like for most of my young top ranked kids, they play with, if they're let's say 8, 9, they're usually playing with 26 to 27 inch racket, but very, very light, super light. The grams is probably, think 220 to 40, definitely not much higher than that in grams. So there's a number of rackets on the market that are super light, but they're 26 or 27 inch, close to normal length, and I like those rackets a lot. And I don't really have, if you have the young ones, the young ones are, it depends on their age, but in general, my recommendation is the opposite for most of the kids that go, like a little bigger than is normally recommended, a little bigger, a little heavier than the typical recommendation, because I find those small rackets very flimsy, and the kids don't play very well with the typically recommended rackets for red and orange, for example. Dave, it's been great answering your questions. I'm just going to wrap up the show, but you can send me those videos and get in touch with me. I'm an actual coach. I am not internet coach. I actually coach kids and build top players, unlike many people on YouTube and on the internet. So ATP forehand, guys. Big debate in the world of tennis. We talked about some of the biomechanics, what it is. We talked about safety. Is it safe? We don't have all the answers to that yet. We talked about how some of the ways to teach it, some different approaches, in terms of methodology, perhaps a bridge approach. I like that concept, a bridge approach rather than just going into deep surgery, reconstructive surgery. I hear that a lot. I'm not sure every young kid needs to have reconstructive surgery, and I'm not sure that's always healthy for them, both mentally and physically and technically. I'm not sure that's always the best course, because with any serious surgery, there's risk of side effects, risk of complications. We talked about the controversy in naming this forehand. I mean, what do we even call it? It's not even just an ATP forehand anymore. It's also a WTA forehand. Will this become the standard forehand on tour? I think it will be. Brian Gordon definitely has predicted that, and I hope he's vindicated. I hope all of the critics for Brian Gordon have to apologize, because I think he's visionary in this area. And I think it's actually coming to fruition right in front of our eyes. We can see more and more women playing just like the men in terms of technique and biomechanics. And I think more and more coaches, including myself, becoming much more open to teaching this to young kids, teaching this to girls, not accepting that the girls are too weak or there's something physiologically inferior about girls that prevents them from learning this optimal technique. I think more and more coaches are open to hearing that message and maybe experimenting, teaching this technique to children and seeing if they're able to learn it. I think that's important. And yeah, the idea of what age is also just complete gray area. We have a lot of question marks. What age to teach this forehand? Should you go all or nothing when the kid's young, 5, 6 years old? Is it better to do the gradual approach, the bridge approach that I mentioned? Some coaches say just leave it alone. Let the kid evolve as they feel comfortable. Some coaches are in that department, in that group. So there's just a lot of controversy and debate still there. But it's a fascinating subject. If you like technique and biomechanics, this is a major question and topic that will continue to be debated and discussed over the coming decades if you're in the tennis world, because there is a shift happening. It's undeniable. You can just look at high-speed video, especially of the women's tour. There's a major shift happening, and we need to talk about it. If you're a serious high-performance coach like me, if you're trying to teach your kids the best possible technique, a lot of parents want to give their kids the best possible technique, the best chance to be a top tennis player. This topic is just going to continue to be on everyone's radar, and I expect that with my new book, Winning Pretty, shameless plug, I think hopefully the book will help, sort of frame the debate and give people a good understanding of what the forehand is biomechanically, what the different questions are, where there's lack of research, and how we can move forward in a responsible way to try to teach kids the optimal technique, but also keep them safe. I think that's important. Obviously, we don't want anyone to get injured. Nobody wants a kid to get hurt. Nobody wants an adult to get hurt. But we shouldn't always let that get in the way, that fear get in the way of developing something new that could be better in terms of performance for players. And I think what's happening now is there is this huge divide in coaching, where we have a group of coaches who want to teach very traditional forms to young kids, and then you have coaches who are more willing to look to the future and who are more open-minded, who are seeing what's happening at the pro level and at high level, and they're saying, "Wait a minute, what's going on here? I want to teach this to kids and adults. I want to teach this to everyone. This is a new way to hit the ball that looks better. So it is a fascinating debate. I appreciate you guys. It's a fascinating topic. I appreciate you guys hanging in there. If you listen to the whole show, I appreciate it. We'll be putting this on the podcast, and you can listen to this while you're working out or going for a jog or driving in the car, driving to one of those tournaments, going into battle with your kid. You can think about the ATP forehand. Should I teach this to my kids? Should my kids start this now? Should I wait till my son or daughter's a little older? Should we go for it right away? These are important questions that we still have some questions about, but it's definitely an interesting topic of discussion. Guys, I'll see you on the next program. God bless. See you next time.